There are certain occasions when I hear or get a recommendation about a certain creature feature or monster movie when I want to like the movie more. I don't dislike the film in particular, or films, but they just don't hit me as well as the person who recommended them or as the people who love them. And that's nothing strange. That's basically applicable to anyone who loves movies. There's always some film that other people like that they just don't get the love for. Why do people love that so much? Why does this group or this particular person personally enjoy that film so much? And I definitely have movies like that for me. One of my favourite horror movies of all time is Rubber, the Killer Tire movie. It's totally ridiculous, but I love it for that. It's so unique. It's got great visuals, great cinematography, weirdly interesting characters, oddball humour, and a great soundtrack. A lot of people, though, would dismiss all of that and just say it's a ridiculous film. I can understand both points of view, but that's just the nature of personal opinion. And for me, this is one of those occasions when I wanted to score this movie higher than I did, and I wanted to enjoy it more than I did, and have it higher on my list of creature feature monster B movies. But unfortunately, spoiler alert, I can't, because that's simply the way it is for me. Now, the movie in question is Deepstar Six, and this tends to be one of those movies which is talked about in a similar vein to movies such as Event Horizon or Leviathan. Now, both of those movies, one for me personally more than the other, are certainly well carried out, interesting alternatives to better known horror films. Event Horizon is a very weird, totally unique sci-fi horror, and Leviathan is one of my personal favourite creature features. It's essentially like The Thing meets Alien meets The Abyss, in effect. Deepstar Six is more so in that latter camp. It's an underwater creature feature B-movie style film with elements of horror, but also, overall, I would say more of a sci-fi feel. So kind of similar to Sphere in that way as well, but not quite as good in terms of the quality that they carried it out with. Now, the casting has some recognisable faces for sure. You have some stereotypical characters in certain roles in a similar way to Leviathan again, and a lot of the feel that the movie has is kind of similar to Leviathan as well. Now, where it differs from Leviathan, at least for me personally, is that I would sum up Deepstar Six in a way that every single thing about the film, be it the visuals, the creature designs, the music, the story, the characters, everything about the film is almost great. But every time, for me personally, it's not quite close enough. So it's interesting, it's a good alternative, and it's certainly one to check out for fans of this genre, but I can't quite put it in my absolute best of lists. So with that in mind, let's get more specific. First of all, then, we have the absolute opening of the film. And again, I'm not going to spoil anything, but I love the opening music. It's a great score. It has a similar kind of vibe to a lot of films which I would say are better than this one, which is a good start, but at the same time, I very quickly noticed that the camera has kind of a misty effect on it, but not in a good way. Almost like you'd have on a looking back on a memory scene in certain older films, that kind of misty, milky look over the camera. And I don't know if that was just the DVD that I was watching or if that changes on different versions, but at least the version that I watched had that. So that immediately kind of took the feel of quality down a little bit. And I'm not just talking about the scenes that are underwater, also when you're not underwater but actually in the underwater habitat, it still looks like that to some degree. Now, the casting is interesting. There are plenty of faces which you will recognise, although many of them aren't on the same par as something like Leviathan, but they're interesting enough. Some of the casting choices are less believable or don't work quite as well as they intended, but overall I'd say it's certainly passable enough, and if you compare it to many other B-movies or creature features, they are better, I will definitely say that. As far as the creatures themselves go, because as I said, this is a creature feature horror movie, they are a bit hit and miss. Some of them are very interesting. You've got some miniatures used, not just for creatures, but for underwater scenes in general, with submersibles and that kind of stuff. And although you can definitely tell that they are miniatures, I kind of like that. I like the look of miniatures used in certain films because it's quite effective. And in some cases, it even has this almost endearing or charming old school feel, in a similar way to something like Harryhausen's stop motion, which I love. I love that kind of throwback, which at the time wasn't a throwback, but now you can look back on it, or like the Blob from the 50s, and appreciate that nostalgic, old school, slightly campy, but for the time, impressive effects. I like that in this movie. I like the use of miniatures, I like the creature designs for the most part. One of the creatures in particular, though, the main creature, is, and this isn't really a spoiler unless you've seen the other movie, a little too reminiscent of the ending of the original Tim Curry Pennywise It movie. And if you've seen that, you'll know what I mean. But the creature in this film was a little bit too reminiscent of that for me, a little bit too reminiscent to be effective, or as effective as it could have been. Especially when you're talking about underwater creatures, you can get really crazy with the way they look, because in real life, many of those creatures do look crazy. Stuff like viper fishes and angler fishes, they genuinely do look crazy. So, get crazy. You have that opportunity to legitimately do that, and sometimes it's not really taken as well as it could be. Some of the gore, though, is very good. There's one scene in particular which stands out, which I'm not going to spoil, but it's certainly an iconic scene of gore from the movie. It's on the front of the DVD box that I had. But as far as the rest of the film, I have to go back to that thing which I said earlier, and it really is the way that I would sum up the entire movie. It feels like it's almost good, or almost great, but not quite. In every particular way, it's just that little bit short of the mark. Now, at the same time, I would still say that it is on par with what it needed to be, because if you think of it of its time, and against the other movies of its time, it's definitely better than a lot of them. At the same time, though, it doesn't hold up as well as many of the others, even from that same era, like Leviathan, The Thing, The Fly, The Blob, do. So that's kind of unfortunate. It's in a little bit of a middle ground. It's good for the time, but it doesn't age as well. And I think as far as my initial thoughts before we get into the individual ratings go, I would say that Deepstar Six is a movie which was just that little bit more B-movie than it was intending to be. Now, it technically is a B-movie, but I think you know what I mean. There are some movies which embrace the B-movie aspect and just go camp and cheesy for the fun of it. Then you have others which elevate the genre, such as The Thing, and go way beyond that to just be a brilliant film, period. But then you have some which try hard, but it's almost like they can't shake that slight silliness which is inherent in the genre. And for me, Deepstar Six unfortunately falls more into that camp. And so, of course, that does finally bring us to my individual scores. So first of all, we have the story and the plot, and unfortunately, I'm going to have to be totally honest, well, as I always am anyway, but I'm going to be totally honest and say that the story in some points is a little bit under par. So I am going to have to reflect that in my score by giving it a 4 out of 10, which sounds like an awful score, I'm sure, but it really isn't. That's only just under what I would say any movie should start at, which is a 5. So it's actually only a little bit under par. However, the reason why I'm rating it a little bit under par, again, without spoiling anything, is that there are certain key choices and key actions from certain characters, and one character in particular, where your suspension of disbelief and the camp factor really is pushed to its limit, and sometimes it goes over the line to make you think, well, this character is doing so many stupid things that are causing so many stupid and dangerous things to happen to others, that you have to think, would someone like that even be in this situation in the first place? Because these are qualified people, and that does hurt the film, because although well-qualified people do make mistakes all the time in movies, there's a difference. People can make mistakes, but if you get the same character doing the same deadly mistakes multiple times, which affect the whole group, and it's the same person each time, that starts to become grating. Now, even then, if it was carried out differently, you could make it work, but in the case of this film, it does feel a bit over the top as far as this character goes. So that in particular is going to hurt the score. Moving directly to the characters though, that to me doesn't necessarily, and this is where it gets a bit ironic, it doesn't hurt that character as much as it hurts the story, because for the character in a vacuum, it's believable. But the way it affects the whole film and the way the whole story almost hinges on the dumb actions of multiple characters, but a few in particular, characters which are literally qualified to know better in this situation, it just hurts it. However, for the characters in particular, as I said, in a vacuum, I'm going to give it a 5. Because the characters who aren't dumb, which is the majority of them, thankfully, do help to level out the score. Now, even a 5 out of 10 isn't exactly amazing, but that is on par. It's what it should be. Because with the ebbs and flows of different characters being better than expected or worse than expected, it kind of levels it out for me. And still, as I said, it's a lot better even than the many dumb characters that you'll see in more recent horror films. As far as the visuals go, well, I'm actually going to give it the highest score, in fact on par with another score to come in just a second, of a 6. Because some of the visuals, as I said earlier, are carried out pretty well. The habitat is interesting enough, the miniatures are pretty cool in that charming old school kind of way, some of the creature designs in particular are quite interesting, some of them not quite as much, and as I said with Blood Glacier, it is more often than not a case of how you use the creatures rather than how the actual creature looks that makes it look a little bit too camp, and unfortunately that does definitely happen in this film. So overall I'm giving it a 6, which is still more than decent enough. It has an interesting look, an interesting feel to the visuals, but it's nothing to write home about. Coming up next though, as I alluded to just now, I am giving it another above par score for, in particular, the audio and soundtrack, because for that I'm going to give it another 6, because as I mentioned earlier, I do like the opening music, I like the soundtrack of the film overall, it's a good score, and the sound design is decent enough, better than the visual design I would say for the most part, so I'm going to give it a 6. A 6 might be a little too high overall, but I do think it's one of the redeeming things about the film. And finally, for the rewatchability and of course the fun factor, both on your own as a sole viewer, also solo rewatchability, but also further than that as a group, well for that, unfortunately I'm going to have to go under par just a little bit again with a 4 out of 10, because for me personally, I do not feel inclined to watch it again. I've watched the movie twice. I watched it once a couple of years ago, then I watched it again more recently to review it and to make notes on it and to score it. But beyond that, I don't plan to see it again, and there are so many genuinely great movies in this genre to watch with a group, or to recommend to a friend and watch it with them, but this one, to be honest, wouldn't be on that list, because there are so many other ones which are better, that it just wouldn't be necessary. Now, it is worthy, for sure, of being reviewed, because it's still way better than many other films in the genre, and that's why I'm reviewing it here, because it does definitely deserve to be talked about. Just don't go into the movie, if you haven't seen it, expecting it to be mind-blowing, because that it certainly isn't. Deepstar 6 is more tropey and more camp, let's say, than I believe it intended to be. And that is unfortunate, because its heart was in the right place, but the way that it's carried out just isn't exactly as good as it could have been. If it were done a little bit differently, this could have genuinely been a great rival to movies like Leviathan. But as is, it's just a little bit under par. However, as far as the scores go, as a tabulation of all 5 put together, I am going to give it an on-par score of 2.5 out of 5, which of course works out to a 5 out of 10 or a 50 out of 100, which is exactly on par. As I've said, a 5 out of 10 in every way is my baseline, so I'm giving it the baseline. And I do believe that overall that is accurate. Although I said that it's an under par creature feature film, at the same time that is my personal perspective. From a technical perspective, I would say that with the ebbs and flows of good stuff and bad stuff cancelling each other out and being in equal measure for the most part, that it does work out to be middle of the road. Which is unfortunate, because it definitely could be worse, but it could have been a whole lot better. But that's it overall for me, and of course I would still recommend checking it out. Just lower your expectations more compared to many of the other monster films that I would typically review. But that's it for this pick. Of course I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.